Is it worth purchasing a practice, or is it just really a glorified client list? So buying a practice, selling a practice, these are things that have come up before at summit events especially. Some of our members have bought practices, which has been great to see and to be able to kind of coach people through the process. I've sold 2 and I've almost bought 3 in my career so far. I can tell you though that a lot of times the thing that matters the most isn't the numbers, it's the people, right? That's going to be the big differentiator. So for example, I've sold a practice twice. The first time it was a terrible shit show and the person who bought it just tanked the whole thing within weeks. The second time it was wonderful. I had an excellent person. We had a very smooth transition and the patients are happy and being well taken care of. So a lot of it depends on the actual humans involved. And there's this little story, like a little fable of there's a boy in school, right? And the teacher says, there's 10 sheep in a field and one jumps over the fence. How many sheep are left? And she asks the boy and the boy says 0. And the teacher says, no, the answer is supposed to be 9, right? 10 minus 1 is 9. You don't know math. And the boy looks at the teacher and says, well, you don't know sheep, right? Because the reality is if one sheep jumps over the fence, then they're all going to follow and there won't be any left. So there's this kind of false sense of security we get from numbers on a paper, right? And that may or may not reflect the reality of what's going on. And this matters when we're going to buy and or sell a practice. A lot of times we got to remember the abstraction of looking at spreadsheets and profit and loss statements and tax returns and all that kind of stuff. It may reflect the reality or it may not. And that's really the best we can do is kind of look at these numbers and all that. But then you've got to come in and actually see what's going on, because things can look really good on paper and not be that great. They can look horrible on paper, but have this upward trend that's going to be happening because you've got deep relationships, right? And it's hard to measure those kinds of things. So we've covered this a lot. I've looked at different ways to kind of value a practice. I'm not going to get into all that here because there's different ways to do it. I mean, I've worked with bankers, I've worked with brokers, I've done all different kinds of things to try to find like, what's the value of a practice? And they all have different ways to go about it. But the kind of like micro lesson here, I guess the sum of this is that if you're going to finance the purchase of a practice, then that practice needs to not only take care of its own bills with its income, as well as a living wage for you, but also be able to pay back the payments on its own self, plus have a buffer, just in case, right? So you got to have all those things going for you. And if you spread out the loan term and you make it longer term, then your payments will be lower, which means that the practice can be less profitable. It'll just take you longer to pay it off and it can still be good. But that being said, I don't want to be in a 5-year payoff term for a practice. I think ideally it should be maybe 1.5 years that the practice should be able to pay for itself. Now, there are some rules of thumb with this. It's like, just take the last year's net, and that's the value of the practice, right? And that's kind of one way to do it. It's just a heuristic. It doesn't always work out. But when you start kind of numbering it out, you want to try to make sure that the practice, as it's functioning, could pay for itself, the purchase price, within a year and a half. Okay, and that's also including a good wage for you and its costs and everything else. Now, that being said, just like the thing with the sheep in the field, you got to remember that there's different incentives for people to report on their business depending on where those reports are going. So, for example, to the IRS, right? If you want to look at practitioners' tax returns for their practice, and what they're going to try to do for the IRS is get it as low as possible, right? Try to get as many deductions as you can and get that income down. Right? But if we're going to a bank for a loan, for credit, we want to show profitability. So in that case, you'd be taking the report and trying to get those numbers up, right? And how this usually looks with accounting is what they call add backs. So the way to reconcile this is you start looking at the deductions. So somebody's tax return might show a very, very low income, but that doesn't mean they didn't make anything that year. It means that they know how to get their income down on paper, right? So they may have taken all kinds of deductions, things like equipment purchases, right? So maybe you're looking at practice and the practitioner just bought a laser machine or something for like 10 grand, right? Well, that means that income for that year is going to show 10 grand less because you had an expense of a big laser machine, but you're not going to have that expense every year, right? That's a one-time purchase. So you kind of want to spread that out and not really look at it like it's really 10 grand off the income. You'd want to add that back, right? Add back. You want to add some of that back in. And the other one is deductions that are non-essential, right? So for example, maybe you're looking, this actually, for me, one of the practices I was looking at buying, the woman who was running it was going to do all these CEUs and things like that. And she would purposefully take her CEUs on these destination holiday places, right? So she'd be like going to Hawaii or wherever, somewhere like really, really nice. And I don't blame her, but like all the price of those accommodations and the flights and the travel and whatever else she was doing, she was wrapping all that up in client and education deduction, right? And really, like, you and I know that we could get our CEUs done a lot cheaper, which means that the business actually doesn't really have those expenses. It's just an optional thing, right? So when practitioners are taking deductions that aren't exactly necessary or are much higher than you would need to run the business, you can oftentimes add that back into the income, right? So like if this trip to Hawaii costs $5,000 and this practitioner's running that off the income to report the revenue, right? Dropping $5,000 off and going, oh, I'm going to write that off for education. Well, we can look at that and go, oh, you didn't make much money last year, but you got to add that $5,000 back as an add back, and then subtract, for your CEUs, maybe you're going to do something a lot less expensive, or whatever, or maybe you want to keep doing it like that, right? So it's not about kind of getting stuck with the numbers, but just understanding how that works and how you may just see a bottom line number of like, this practitioner made $50,000 last year, but really their clinic brought in like $350,000, and they're just really good at taking depreciation and write-offs and things like that. Right? So you got to be able to add that back and try to figure out what the actual income coming in is. And the other tip that I'll give is banks, right? Because banks are going to have a different risk tolerance than brokers. Brokers want the valuation to be higher because they're going to get a commission from that. It's usually like 5%, 7%, 10%, something like that, depending on how many brokers are involved, a buyer's broker and a seller's broker, right? It's just like real estate agents, they'll split that commission. Right. So typically a broker's incentive is to get the practice valued as high as possible and then to get a deal to go through. That being said, the broker isn't incentivized for the highest price because at a certain point the price is too high, there won't be a deal at all. So the broker's incentivized to get the price, the value, buyer or a seller broker, they both get commissions, so they both have the same incentives, but they want the price to be as high as possible and still have a deal go through. Right. A bank, on the other hand, if you're looking for a loan as a purchaser, the bank is going to be incentivized to take a serious look at the risk because they're going to have skin in the game if they loan you money, right? Because then if the practice isn't that great and then it can't pay itself and it won't pay you and you won't pay the bank, then they're out, right? So banks actually have teams of people for business loans that will evaluate a business, and they look at it from a very cynical, pessimistic point of view. Right? So it's worth getting kind of these different perspectives. Yeah, you can have your accountant look, which is great, right? Accountants, depending on the accountant, they're not always strategic, right? Sometimes they're just very good at like putting one thing in the right box and making sure all of that's clean, right? It's a good skill to have, but that doesn't mean that they understand the moving parts or the strategy of kind of why things are working the way they do. Some accountants do, some don't, right? A broker, again, is going to be kind of incentivized to like inflate the value generally within reason, and a bank is going to be incentivized to be extremely pessimistic. So you might want to get like 3 sets of eyes on this thing if you're considering purchasing it. Now that said, the real question underneath is like, why purchase, right? And also why sell? I'm kind of making this video more for a potential practice buyer, but I do know that we have some members who are in a position where they're getting ready to sell their practice. This is also something to think about. Which we can talk more about this stuff, just ask in the group. But when you're new, if you don't already have, a sustainable business, you got to build it, right? So when we're new, we oftentimes have skills like we're good at our treatments, right? Are we perfect? Are we masters? No, but we're proficient. Yeah, pretty good, especially compared to other skills like attraction and marketing and the ability to communicate and sales processes and operations and systems and things like that, right? Like clinical systems, you may not have that same level of proficiency as you do with choosing your modalities, right? So oftentimes we need to offset those skill gaps so that we can start to make a living and we can learn and learn and learn. There are different ways to do this. One of them is to be an employee, right? You could work somewhere out of school. You're not going to be paid very much, right? But the income loss you take by working somewhere, if it works out well, that practice is doing things like attraction and having systems and being able to take you under its wing a little bit and build that up. Right, so you take an income hit, which is like an opportunity cost, essentially. Like you're not making as much as you would be if you were totally on your own, right? But because of that, the money you're not making is essentially an investment in the practice that you're joining, taking all that complexity, in the areas where your skills aren't developed, right? Taking insurance is another one. I know I talk about this a lot, but basically if you're going to take insurance, you're taking essentially a pay cut for the reduction of complexity. The insurance company is going to have a list. Patients find you on the list. Now you don't have to know how to do a traction, right? Don't have to develop that. You can just worry about your own modalities. The insurance company is going to have the rates they reimburse, right? Now you don't have to worry about pricing and figuring that out. You can just take whatever the insurance pays. The insurance is going to have a certain plan limit, 20 treatments per year. Well, now you don't have to be good at prognosis or treatment plans, right? Because it'll just be whatever the insurance says. So these are ways to offset our skill gaps. I laugh, but it's like, it's normal and it's good to go through these processes. And sometimes we have to have outside relationships to speed us along. And none of these things are like bad. It's just a matter of if it's a right fit for you at a right time in your development. And buying a practice is no different, right? You're gonna lay out some cash, and what that does is that gets you a head start. So when they say like, oh, is this just a glorified client list and like some old furniture, well, sort of, yeah, you're gonna get the hard assets of, the waiting room couch and the reception desk and some treatment tables and whatever else comes, right, with the space, which can be good, to not have to lay out cash for that. But the real strength is the relationships and your positioning and being put in that position where you are now the person who everybody's looking to for treatments, right? I mean, that's it's a great way to walk into something when it works. And this is, again, why I say it depends on the people, right? Because as soon as you bring people in, you get people problems, basically. And this is kind of how it's gone for me. Like I mentioned, I had one that was a total shit show. I had a lot of faith in the person that I brought in. I thought she was going to do a great job. She knew her stuff in a lot of ways, but she wasn't very good at other things. And, I spent some time trying to mentor her and all that. We had a few months maybe together to kind of prepare, but it wasn't enough, for her skill gaps. And I wasn't in a place where I could recognize and anticipate like a little bit of her rapport issues or some of her kind of her clinical boundaries. Like they just weren't there yet, and looking back, it all makes sense. But I was kind of, newer in the field at that point when I was selling that practice. And it didn't go well, but it's mainly because of the personal things, right? Because I had a great list of patients, for her and they were ready. They were loyal, wonderful folks that I really enjoyed working with, and they were ready to just go see her because she was, she had my endorsement and she was taking over. And I was really disappointed about that. And some of it was I'm accountable for like not training her harder, but at the same time, like you can only train somebody so much, and sometimes you gotta recognize if it's going to be a good fit or not, and you just have to develop that eye, right? So the seller can get burned on this. The buyer can get burned too. Everybody's worried about getting burned, right? So here's how you prevent it: is you work for some good faith, and you try to find out what the actual human is doing and what their incentives are. So a lot of times sellers get an inflated value of their practice and they just want a quick cash out, or they have life circumstances. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on. Maybe somebody's got to move because they have an aging relative, or maybe it's like a practitioner who's married to somebody in the military, right? And the military spouse just got relocated, and now it's like I gotta leave this practice and go, with my spouse. There's all different reasons why people want to close their practice or leave their practice or whatever, and it's normal to want to sell it and like keep it alive, right? Sellers can get burned when potential buyers come in, especially when they're going to, if they already live in the area or they just moved to the area and now they're working as an associate underneath. So it's like, okay, practitioner A is selling, and then you got this practitioner B as the buyer coming in and working as an associate, right? And if they don't have a hard contract in place, then what gets really tricky is that practitioner B can back out of the deal at the last minute, and practitioner A has been setting up their life to relocate and move by a certain date, and there's no sale, there's nothing, and actually practitioner A has been training this person and like making all these introductions, and the person, instead of becoming a buyer, they just wait for the practitioner A to leave, and then they just stay there and pick up all the pieces, right? So there's a lot of kind of dirty stuff like that, like people will scavenge and things. So you got to protect yourself. If you're selling, before you start really training somebody, you got to have some skin in the game on their side. Now the other one too is like for the buyer, if you really want to buy a practice and you're sincere about it, it's your risk isn't before the sale, your risk is after the sale, right? So the seller is risking their time before the sale, training and helping and making connections, and then they get screwed, right? The buyer's risk is that after the sale, the seller is like not available for any support if anything comes up whatsoever, right? They just cut and run. They got paid, they cashed out, they're done. So if you're selling, one of the ways to protect yourself before you kind of pour your heart into this new person is to have something, down payment, contract, there's got to be something locked in with a commitment, skin in the game on behalf of the buyer, right? Now, for the buyer to have some kind of assurance after the sale, you don't have to do it this way, but this is one way, is if there's some form of seller financing or seller carry, meaning the seller didn't get paid every single thing all at once. There's something going on, whether it's some monthly payments for a few months or a year or whatever, where the former seller, the seller, right, is still incentivized to look after their former practice a little bit and be there in a consulting, mentoring type capacity, right? So like the last clinic I sold, I was very happy to talk to my replacement, right? If he had any questions whatsoever about any patients, any cases, what's going on with this paperwork, where are we at with this? I was very responsive, I would just be happy to talk about this stuff. And I still am, even years later. Like if something comes up, I'm happy to do it, right? But that's, not everybody's like that, right? So if you have some kind of incentive for the seller to stay motivated and actually continue caring about the future of the thing, even though after they've moved on, that's a great way to kind of do it with it's a little bit of a low faith estimate, right? But it's kind of like one of those things where maybe even the last 10% of the purchase price or something, the seller gets that 6 months after the sale or a year after the sale or something like that. You can work these things out because what that does is it incentivizes the person to still support the new practitioner, right? Because again, it's the relationships, it's the people that make it work. That's just, that's really what it all comes down to. So it's like, oh, is this just a glorified client list? Like kind of, but like don't underestimate the value of a strong list at all. And for a seller, don't overestimate it either, right? A lot of times sellers get the inflated value, like a broker tells them, oh, your practice is worth, boom, and they anchor to some crazy number that's not realistic that a banker wouldn't get behind, right? You got to be able to price your practice where it's actually feasible for the person to take it over and buy it properly. Right, so be willing to price it to sell, and at the same time, be willing to have terms that are a little bit creative and a little bit flexible so that both sides can have some mutual assurance that there's going to be trust through the process, right? So there's the general kind of ins and outs of buying and selling a practice. There's a lot more to this. Individual cases will vary, of course, and there's all different ways to do it. But the main thing is the skill development. Like I said, like you're buying a practice to kind of accelerate your positioning in the field and to get like a good income and all that. But that doesn't take the elephant off your back of having to develop skills and attraction, right? Because once it's your practice, you bought it, you're still going to have to, there's no turnkey forever system, right? Like it doesn't matter what the seller says about, oh, it's perfect. Like I had one practice I was looking at and the seller was like, I have 100% market share. I've got a total domination of my entire area, right? I'm the only one. I'm the monopoly on acupuncture in my area. I was like, wow, this is great, She's really got the market cornered, right? And for me, that was this, oh, I'll be safe if I buy this practice. It's solid, right? And I went out, looked at the practice. Marissa, my wife, was with me, right? And we're going to the practice, and there's the practice we're looking at, and across the parking lot is another acupuncture clinic right there. I said, how do you have 100% market share if you've got a neighbor who also does acupuncture? Like, do you know what these words mean? I don't worry about her, she doesn't do it. Okay, right? Sometimes people can be just fucking, who knows what they're drinking, right? So you got to do your due diligence. You got to check things out. But even if there was 100% market share, all this stuff was totally locked in, you still got to develop the skills to maintain this practice, right? It's a fresh start, but you got to maintain it, right? So you got to be able to develop attraction and be able to still create interest amongst strangers to come into your world. You got to know how to talk to them. You got to create offers, right, that keep people committed for long term so that they can get the results that they deserve, so that you can then have happy, successful patients, right, that are now referring. You gotta be able to develop these things. And that's why these are some of the core skills we look at here, because whether you want to work online, in person, whatever, this isn't going away. You still got to develop these skills. Whether you buy a practice, whether you take insurance, whether you become an employee, whether you're doing house calls, whether you're going straight totally online, these are universal skills that you have to learn, right? And you want to get better and better and better at them. I used to think if I bought a practice, it would just like solve things for me. Honestly, I would think, well, this person's successful. If I can step into their hermit crab shell, right, then I'll grow into it and I'll become successful too. And I used to think that the practitioners I was looking at buying their practice, I used to think they knew something I didn't know. And sometimes they did, right? And I learned a lot of things. But I remember thinking like, oh, I'm going to go shadow and I'll watch how they do their intake because it's the way they're doing their consults. That's what's doing it, right? And I'd go watch. It's just a normal intake. Nothing fancy. Oh, it must be something with their treatments, and I look at it, I'm like, it's just normal acupuncture. Like nothing fancy, what's going on here? Well, what I came to realize was that oftentimes really these people are successful because they just didn't go anywhere. They've just been in the same place for 10, 15, 20 years. And after year 10, whatever, things started to pick up and now they've got this practice. They don't necessarily even know how they did it, right? So instead of trying to copy somebody's thing that they kind of like got without knowing how, I started to look at, okay, how do we actually do this? How do we engineer success without relying on luck and without having to wait 10 years for things to take off, right? So it all comes down to skill development. That's ultimately for me what it came down to. Now, if you're going to buy a practice, you're going to want to emulate some of the systems that are in place, right? And you're going to want to change some things too. And don't get me wrong, like I'm not saying buying a practice is like, if you bought a practice, that means you're not developing your skills. It's not either or. And in fact, buying a practice can be an awesome accelerant. And now you have this whole group of people where you can start to practice these new skills, right? So it can be both. But what I would kind of caution against is that belief that if you just buy one, then you can just finally relax because now everything's taken care of. It's not. It's not. You're still in charge. You still got to run the ship, right? You bought a great ship that's running, but you got to keep it going. You got to keep it floating. You got to be a leader. You got to be inspired, and you got to not fall into weird traps of trying to fill somebody else's shoes and whatever. You got to be you, right? And at the same time, try to keep a relatively consistent experience. So it can work really, really well. But I would say the value on is it just a client list? Is it like, what is going on here? It is, but that can be incredibly valuable depending on the people, depending on the relationships. So that's what you want to start to look at. You want to start to look at, okay, here's a metric, right? Here's one way to start to tell is to go, okay, how many of these patients that this clinic has are referrals versus they're paying for them every month from Google or something like that? Like what are the systems? How are the new patients coming in, right? The same way you diagnose a patient by looking at their systems and all that, you can diagnose a practice. You can start to look at things that way. Okay, what are the inputs? Where are these coming from? What's the causal web here, right? How is all this working? Because you can get two things that look really good on paper, but one of them is all organic referrals because this practice is generating very happy patients in an area where people talk and you're building a community around the work, right? Or there's another one that has the same operating expenses, same revenue, all that, but they're having to pay for every single patient because nobody sticks around and nobody refers, right? So it's two different situations. You got to look at the qualitative stuff. All right, hope that helps. Get to work.